Well, welcome to the BreakPoint podcast. I'm Shane Morris, senior writer here at the Colson Center. Vox describes it as the spiritual home of figures as varied as George W. Bush, Dick Cheney, Hillary Clinton, and Elizabeth Warren. It's a large and storied communion that traces its roots to the Wesley brothers and has been one of the largest historical sponsors of global missions. The United Methodist Church is, or maybe soon was, the second largest Protestant denomination in America and has a worldwide membership of around 13 million. But church leaders announced Friday that after years of tension over issues like abortion and especially LGBT issues, they've decided to split the denomination in two, with the Evangelical side leaving to form its own body despite consistently voting in the majority. Today I'm joined by a thinker with deep roots in the Methodist tradition and a love for this church. Mark Tooley is the president of the Institute on Religion and Democracy in Washington, D.C., and a former CIA man. He's also an editor of Christian Foreign Policy Journal and the author of several books on this topic, including Taking Back the United Methodist Church and Methodism and Politics in the 20th Century. Mark, it's a great pleasure to have you on the BreakPoint podcast today.
Great to be with you.
Well, Mark, first off, I'm thinking of our evangelical listeners here. If you could tell us a little bit about how it came to this. What led to this moment? Why are Methodists fighting about homosexual relationships, among other things? Isn't the Bible really clear on that?
Well, of course, this debate among United Methodists is not really ultimately about sexuality. That's only the presenting issue. It's about much more deep-seated theological differences that date back more than 100 years, when theological liberalism took over the seminaries of all of the mainline Protestant denominations. But it wasn't until the 1970s and 1980s when the sexualities were the fruit of that takeover, and hence all of the mainline Protestant denominations, or virtually all, liberalized their sexuality teachings over the last 15 or 20 years, with many conservatives consequently exiting, except for the United Methodist Church. And they are different because their membership is global and because United Methodism is growing in Africa even as it declines in the U.S. That presented at least legislatively at the governing convention every 4 years, a conservative majority that prevented the denomination from liberalizing its teaching that marriage is only between male and female.
Okay, so a Lutheran friend of mine quipped last week that this split kind of sounds like a bunch of carnivores joining a vegan club and then telling the vegans that if they don't like hamburgers, they need to go form their own new club. The Wesleyan tradition, like pretty much all of Christianity before recently, is historically clear on what marriage is and the nature of sexuality. Why are the conservatives, who are consistently voting in the majority here, why are they the ones leaving?
Well, I think it's better understood as not anyone leaving, but effectively the United Methodist Church, which actually was founded in its current form in 1968 from a merger between the Methodist Church and another denomination, is effectively ending potentially in the year 2020, and emerging from it will be two or perhaps even more denominations, one traditional, one liberal, maybe even a radical version of the church. But your question goes to the logistics of this division, in that the liberals will inherit the bureaucracy of the old denomination, in part because conservatives don't want that bureaucracy. It's overly large, unsustainable, all liberal, ineffective, not focused on the local church. So for many conservatives, the liberals can have it. We want to start fresh.
Well, I grew up in the Southern Baptist Convention, and I've spent much of my adult life over in the Presbyterian Church in America. And the stories of many of these old Protestant traditions are parallel in ways. So the Presbyterian Church in America is one of several denominations that formed in the aftermath of the breakup of one of the old Presbyterian mainline denominations. And the current Presbyterian mainline is the PCUSA, which is why I always have to tell everyone, no, I'm not that kind of Presbyterian. Given that history, which seems to be repeating itself with the United Methodist Church, what has sort of kept you over the years in the UMC? Why is it that you've stuck around when so many denominations seem to have followed a parallel track and into liberalism and fallen apart?
Well, I grew up in and came to faith in the United Methodist Church, so I owe it a great deal. My family has roots in the church going back 200 years, and there's also been a large conservative or evangelical subculture in the United Methodist Church, even as liberalism controlled all the structures of control and hierarchy. And the culture in the average local church is not liberal. It tends to be at least right of center, if not conservative.
Well, you mentioned a moment ago the African membership and the dynamic that that's introduced into the United Methodist Church over the course of this controversy. Methodism is a global communion, and it's actually, unlike many of the mainline churches, growing in contrast to those Protestant denominations. Who are these conservatives in the Methodist Church exactly, who are going to be forming potentially their own denominations, and how have they kept the denomination from sliding all the way into what I would describe as an apostasy?
Well, there's always been an evangelical subculture in the Methodist Church. When liberalism took over the denomination pretty early in the 20th century, the evangelicals sort of withdrew into that subculture. And then in the late 1960s, evangelicals formed their caucus, which was known as Good News. So for over 50 years, Good News contended for the Orthodox faith, joined later on by other traditional caucuses, and they kept the flame burning and did not reclaim the denominational structures or the agencies, but did keep the denomination from liberalizing on sexuality and actually equalized it a little bit on its official theological stances. And then in 2016, pulled the denomination out after 40 years from pro-abortion rights ecumenical coalition. But all of that was only possible because of the African church, because they aligned with American evangelicals, created this new conservative governing majority.
And that's been what's so frustrating about watching the coverage of this, Mark, is that so much of it seems to imply that the evangelicals are the ones, for lack of a better word, contaminated the church. They're the ones who have refused this historical evolution in a liberal direction, and so they're causing the split. And it's just not fair. Not only that, but most of the coverage doesn't mention the fact that you just mentioned, that this evangelical resistance, so to speak, is centered largely in Africa. I've heard it, I think, rightly compared, the liberal effort to force these sexual revolutionary values on the African Methodists. I've heard it compared to a sort of religious or theological colonialism. Here's our enlightenment, here's our new way of doing things, and this is how you have to believe now and behave. And those overseas are saying, look, this is what the church has always believed. We can't be unfaithful to our tradition or to Scripture or to God. That's just what strikes me as so unfair about the whole coverage. Speaking of unfair coverage, the Vox article I mentioned earlier characterized the split in a way that I just think is outrageous. It says the number of Americans who regularly attend church is sitting at its lowest point in decades, and millennials in the U.S. are particularly turned off by anti-LGBTQ church doctrine. And it goes on, there are many reasons why Americans aren't as religious as they used to be, but for many young people, the way their LGBTQ friends are treated by hardline Christians and Catholics is often a motivator for leaving the church. Okay, it sounds to me like what Vox is saying here, or implying, is that lack of acceptance of homosexuality and LGBTQ identity or whatever is causing the decline in American Christianity. But that misses a critical fact, doesn't it? That the churches declining fastest are the ones that affirm LGBTQ identity and relationships, right?
Well, that's exactly right. Liberal denominations, not just in America, but around the world, are all in decline. I can't think of a single liberal Protestant denomination in the world that's growing right now. And of course, they're all aging very quickly. They don't have successful young adult ministry. You should look who's planting churches in urban areas, including right here in Washington, D.C. They're all evangelical. Mainline Protestants aren't and really can't plant effective churches that reach millennials. And in terms of conservative denominations in America, yes, there are some that are declining. The Southern Baptists have been declining for about 15 years, but there are growing denominations in America. The Assemblies of God, Christian Missionary Alliance, the Presbyterian Church in America is growing again. There are others, so it's fair to say that there are no liberal growing denominations, and being conservative is no guarantee of growth, but all growing denominations are conservative. And then finally, the greatest growth area in American Christianity, of course, is non-denominational churches, which almost uniformly are evangelical.
Why do you think liberal churches have such an issue with church growth? Why can't they seem to gain new members?
Well, it's counterintuitive. You would think if they're attuned to the surrounding culture, that they would appeal to the surrounding culture and attract crowd. But I would argue that churches attract people because they offer a distinct message that's different from the surrounding culture, that's interesting and compelling, and maybe people don't like it, but at least it gets their attention. But if the church just offers whatever everyone else is saying, maybe it attracts no resistance, but it also attracts minimal interest.
Right. A friend of mine described the theology taught in many mainline churches as, the Ellen DeGeneres show with worse production value.
Well, that's right. The church really can't compete in that arena and always loses.
So Grove City College professor and Presbyterian theologian Carl Trueman wrote in First Things about the Methodist split recently, and he said, "The sexual revolution has always been but a symptom of the selfhood revolution, whereby excessive individualism came to dominate how our culture understands the purpose of life. And that means that any church where same-sex marriage is significant enough to cause divisive debate is a church where significant parties have already absorbed that spirit of the age regarding personhood, love, sex, sexuality, whether intentionally or by cultural osmosis," he says. And that in turn means it is a church where significant parties have already abandoned basic Christian anthropology and an Orthodox understanding of biblical authority. Basically, he's saying this is a symptom of a disease that's already progressed so far that the church is, fatally sick. Do you think that's fair? Does it strike you as overly fatalistic, especially given, denominations like the Southern Baptist Church or the Lutheran Church Missouri Synod that have had sort of revivals and moves back away from liberalism?
Well, it sounds overly fatalistic. I know many conservatives want to think that the current American culture is just the most decadent ever, and there is decadence in it, but I don't know that it's more decadent than 100 years ago. Our decadence is a different kind of decadence, but if I had to choose between drag queens or 20,000 Klansmen marching down Pennsylvania Avenue in the 1920s, which would you choose? They're both undesirable for different reasons. So the church is always operating in a culture that's at odds with the gospel, and it's the church's vocation to work to be a witness in the culture and to redeem the culture.
So what would you say is your breaking point? How far would a denomination have to go institutionally into liberalism for you to say, no, that's too much, I'm out?
Well, for many conservatives in Methodism and the other mainline denominations, it was the teaching on sexuality and marriage, but that was late in the game. So decades before that, you had bishops and theologians denying the deity of Christ and his virgin birth, obviously scriptural authority. So the debates over sexuality were just a late consequence of theological liberalism. But I think broadly speaking, as long as the official doctrine remains Orthodox believers can make the case for staying in, no matter how unevenly that doctrine is upheld. But if the church officially overturns Orthodox teachings, then I think it's a real challenge to remain in, unless you simply see yourself as a missionary.
Well, given this split, Mark, where does it leave Orthodox faculty at Methodist institutions, seminaries, and colleges?
Very good question. United Methodism has 13 official seminaries around the U.S. 12 of them will align with the liberal denomination. One probably will align more with the conservative denomination. And then there's Asbury Theological Seminary in Kentucky, which is not United Methodist, but more United Methodist attend there than any of the official seminaries. And it will service and provide graduates for the conservative church. And hopefully, probably, help will be needed from other Wesleyan seminaries aligned with the Free Methodists, the Wesleyans, the Nazarenes, and others.
Well, looking ahead here, because the evangelicals will be free from the institution that you mentioned that they just don't want, that goes with the old Methodist Church, what underlying tensions and controversies do you think the evangelicals will finally be able to suss out at this point? The things they will be able to deal with? I'm thinking of issues like marriage, divorce, perhaps even women's ordination.
Well, women's ordination is not a topic of debate among Methodists, but there'll have to be a lot of work done in other areas in terms of ecclesiology and the authority of bishops and congregationalism versus connectionalism. Many conservative Methodists, in terms of having for decades having to ignore or hunker down in protection from the liberal church bureaucracy, have developed a much more of post-denominational evangelical Congregationalist attitudes, so that will leak into Methodism and have to be addressed. So basically the whole Methodist Wesleyan classical tradition is going to have to be rediscovered and represented to a whole new generation.
Well, this is part of the question that all Protestants and evangelicals who've broken off from a liberal mainline denomination are asking themselves. How do we keep this from repeating itself in 20 years? What is it that you think evangelicals in the Methodist tradition can do at this point, and what can other traditions apply to keep this sort of debacle from recurring over and over again? How do you stop the creep of liberalism?
Keeping a very tight relationship with the seminaries and governing the theological standards for incoming clergy. So the mainline churches, the Methodists and others, early in the 20th century prided themselves in giving the seminaries autonomy and unlimited theological freedom and not having any direct accountability to the church as a whole. And of course, that's what brought down the mainline Protestant world. So it'll have to be understood that the seminaries are servants of the church and not vice versa.
Where do you see Protestantism going in the long term, given the sort of resurgence of Orthodox faith that's happening, or rather the spread of Orthodox faith that's happening overseas? I mean, what does the long-term fate of this whole group of traditions look like in your view?
Well, some people would think the mainline Protestant tradition was a cultural phenomenon that basically expired late in the 20th century and has no future. But I'm concerned that generic evangelicalism is not of itself sufficient to guide future Protestant Christianity, and that we really need to rediscover the great Protestant traditions, Wesleyan, Calvinist, Anglican, Lutheran, others. And that's where the future of Protestant Christianity in America and globally needs to be rooted, that we can't just be in the moment, but we need to be historically connected to the great traditions that gave us so much richness in terms of theology and morals and ethics and how to live Christian lives in society.
So let's say one of our listeners is considering local Methodist church but wants to find out whether it's on the Orthodox side of things. What should they do? Who should they talk to?
Well, the division, of course, has not yet taken place. So if they're looking right now, you just have to do what I do when I'm traveling and look at the website and look for clues in terms of the beliefs of that church and its minister. But your average local church is not strictly liberal or conservative. It's just kind of in between. And if you just go to an hour worship service, it probably will be fine.
They could also check for rainbow flags out front. That might be a...
Well, if there are a lot of rainbow flags, that's one important signal. A lot of political statements on the website, that's another signal.
Well, Mark, where can our listeners find out more about your work?
Please check us out at our website, theird.org, theird.org, and our blog that it connects to is called Juicy Ecumenism, and it's very heavy on Methodist coverage.
Okay, real quickly, I have to ask, what is up with that name? What does Juicy Ecumenism mean?
Our Anglican staffer, Jeff Walton, gets credit for developing that name. I wasn't even in the room when it was designed, but it has stuck. It works out well. Some people don't like it, but we're sticking with it no matter what.
Oh, it's unique. It's certainly unique. Well, Mark, it's been an informative time here and just really enjoyable to talk with you. I want to thank you for all you do at IRD and also for joining me here today on the BreakPoint podcast.
All right, thank you. Enjoyed the conversation, and maybe you'll be able to visit the new conservative Methodist church sometime a couple years from now.
I'll look forward to it. Folks, be sure to come to breakpoint.org for information and links to the stories we mentioned here today on the program. And during the month of January, we're offering a free subscription to World Magazine in exchange for your donation to the Colson Center. This offer includes 24 print issues as well as full access to digital content from a trusted news source that's grounded in hope and biblical truth. You can give today and receive your subscription at breakpoint.org/January. For the Colson Center, I'm Shane Morris.